Thank you very much. I probably should start with a confession. The truth is I use these blooper reels to gauge the level of the audience I'll be facing. I can see I face a group of intellectuals this morning. I'm being quite serious. Really, the greatest laughs we've gotten on the blooper reels have been in showings for astronauts in space laboratories and at top colleges. The only place that we showed them that we never got a laugh was in a showing for television executives, which seems to indicate that there is a correlation between sense of humor and intelligence. I probably should admit I will be having some fun today at the expense of television executives, but my quarrel is not with the people. It's with the nature of commercial television as it exists today, and I will be coming back to that later. As far as individuals go, there are as many good people in television networks and studios as there are in any other large American corporation. They are skilled professionals who represent a broad range of backgrounds, such as advertising, public relations, brokerage houses, the petroleum industry, law, and other quasi-criminal activities. What will we be talking about today? Inside Star Trek, yes, since that's what brought a lot of you here, and some very funny things that have happened in the making of some other science fiction television shows. But if you've watched any of these shows, you should be forewarned that I use entertainment for more than just enjoyment. I refuse to write and produce a script, and I would not travel this far, nor would I have you turn out today if in between and around the jokes I could not talk about some other things, and perhaps at times some fairly heavy things. I think we should go first to Star Trek, what is happening. And you heard the announcement that we're going to make a motion picture. We owe that to the Star Trek fans. As you may or may not know, they are a lovely but rather peculiar life form who seem to be born with a roll of stamps in one hand and a typewriter in the other, which is to say that they will write letters on a drop of a hat. And thank God, since our second year on the air, for those of you who don't know, we were saved from cancellation by over 1 million letters from the fans to NBC. And Paramount, which controls the basic copyright, has been deluged for 2 years with the same kind of mail, and Paramount has finally said enough. And as you heard, we have completed negotiations, and I am presently writing the script. It'll be a widescreen, major budget motion picture. And the negotiations did not always go smoothly. When we first started, Paramount announced to me that they would like the show recast, of course, put in proven box office names. I suppose they meant something like Robert Redford for Mr. Spock. And I agreed that there are no doubt a lot of good actors, but I didn't think the fans would go for that, and so somehow word got out to the fans that that's what the studio was saying, and the deluge of mail recently started all over again. And it reached a point where I received a rather bitter telephone call from one of the heads of Paramount. It seems the fans had gotten a hold of his home address. And his demand to me was rather simple: call them off or else. Which, coming from the studio that made The Godfather, is a little scary. But at any rate, the deluge of mail has caused Paramount to change its mind, and when we begin shooting the Star Trek motion picture, we will try to get all the original cast. I think I had an indication that Star Trek had a future long before then, and it was when my wife began agitating for better lines. And for those of you who don't know, my wife, Majel, on Star Trek, played Nurse Chapel, who you just saw being grabbed by Dr. McCoy, and apparently enjoying it. As some of you know, there are circles in which I'm called the great bird of the galaxy. At studios and networks, it's Crazy Jean. Majel has a term all of her own. She considers me the Benedict Arnold of show business. All through her career as an actress, she has heard those old stories about the advantages of sleeping with the producer. She's fond of pointing out in the case of our marriage, it has taken her from co-starring roles down to a bit spaceship nurse with memorable lines like, "Yes, doctor." She had some hopes when she got the first script and learned that Nurse Chapel was to be in love with Mr. Spock. She found out I double-crossed her there, too, by writing into the format that Vulcans come in heat only once every 7 years. I think the question most often asked about Star Trek is why the incredible support of the fans. Why is this show, now on its 14th rerun across the nation, playing to more people than it played to on its original primetime network run? And how does a television show result in conventions that perhaps you've heard about New York, Los Angeles, and around that will bring out as many as 10,000 fans caravanning, flying, driving from around the country? I think this is a much more important question than Star Trek itself. It suggests that television can be, or should be, much more than just an inconvenient blot on our culture. It suggests to me that historians may look back on television today and see much of it or most of it as almost a criminal waste of an opportunity to reach and expand the minds of humanity. I do not see Star Trek as any great work of art. I do not consider it to be all things to all people. But out of the thousands of letters generated by the show, out of the hundreds of personal contacts that I've been fortunate to make, I'd like to describe two occurrences that can tell us a little bit about what television could do. One of these was a letter I received about 3 years ago from the University of Wisconsin. And it went something like that, Dear Mr. Roddenberry, when Star Trek came on the air, I was graduating from high school and I decided not to go on to college. I'm now graduating from engineering with honors, and I want to thank you. And wow, that's a very heavy type thing to get. Another incident in another area, I was in Charlotte, North Carolina recently. Some students were taking me around, and they had some things to do. I asked them to drop me off at a coffee shop. And the only open table was with a policeman, a police officer of the city. I had on sort of my Hollywood clothes then, a spangled jacket and some things, and I found him looking up at me very strangely and worried. And he said, I said, don't worry, I used to be a policeman, I'm not dangerous. And he looked at me and said, well, what do you do now? And I said, well, I work in science fiction. And he said, say, have you seen this show Star Trek? And I said, oh yeah, I've seen it. And he said, well, listen, they got something. I got from that man a 15-minute lecture on tolerance, stated in terms of Star Trek, that to be different is not necessarily to be ugly and so on. We received a copy of a master's thesis in mass psychology, which suggested still another reason for the show's popularity. And it points out that while most television lead characters were anti-heroes, Star Trek had true hero figures. In fact, heroes that were almost old-fashioned in their insistence on personal integrity, that their word and their oath was their bond, that there are more things in life than personal advantage and personal comfort. Indeed, there may be things worth a life of danger or even dying for. I think this explanation, like the past one, reflects credit more on the audience than on the show. Without any doubt, the greatest hunger in this world today is for images to admire and to emulate. Who would you pick as a model for your children today? As I grew up, it was quite simple. You picked the President of the United States. Why hasn't the same phenomenon happened on other shows? Many of them have used equally skilled actors. I happen to think that many of them at times have used better directors and writers, been more skillfully produced. Again, I think the answer lies with the audience. The audience may enjoy the entertainment, but it will refuse to admire television heroes whose goal in life is like Cool Million, to make $1 million every week. Or with A Half Mechanical Man, another science fiction show, who works for the CIA protecting us from evil foreigners. Or with the greed shows, who make it pornographically possible for a lady to climax on stage as she wins a new automobile. There may very well be truth in the theory that lacking human, real-life images to admire and emulate, our television characters were adopted by many as surrogate images, fictional images, temporary, waiting the day that flesh and blood integrity again appears on the scene. Could the show be summed up as making any particular statement? Because I'm sure, as you know, our principal popularity in colleges has been the statements it made. I think they can be summed up in making two main statements. At least this is what we were trying to say. First, we were trying to say that humanity will reach maturity and wisdom on the day that it begins to positively value diversity in life and in ideas. As I heard repeated from the Southern policeman, to be different is not necessarily to be ugly. To have a different idea is not necessarily to be wrong. The worst possible thing that could happen to all of us is for us, everyone, to begin to look and act and talk and think alike. If we cannot handle and learn to enjoy the differences between our own kind here on Earth, God help us when we get into space and meet the variety that is almost certainly out there. Finally, I think Star Trek was a statement of affection and optimism about living things in general, and I think this again reflects credit on the audience. I've often been asked, you have fans on your show that are 10 years old, and you have college presidents and space scientists and astronauts, firemen, policemen. Is there any one thing that they seem to have in common? Yes. Well, there's one thing we have noticed. Invariably, our fans have youthful minds. And so when we were saying it's not all over, it's not all been invented, it's really all just beginning, I think this is a terribly, terribly important statement to young-minded people, whatever their age. All of which usually brings up an interesting question. It goes something like, hey, wait, Roddenberry, how can you say that it's all just beginning for us when you've gone ahead and wrote shows like Genesis 2 and others, which have said that our technological civilization that we enjoy now is probably going to crumble? And in answer, while writing the original Star Trek format, I never considered for a moment that the USS Enterprise and the Federations and the thing represented by that were necessarily a direct and interrupted outgrowth of our present civilization with its heavy emphasis on material things. And you might ask, doesn't the collapse of all or much of what we have now mean the end to all of us? Of course not. Humanity is an incredible creature. Knock us down, destroy our civilization, and we will probably get up and build a better one on top of it, as we have done time and time again. And those of you that are frightened at some of the things happening today and the thought that our civilization could crumble to, let us consider what happened the last time. The collapse of Rome, or perhaps, since these things take generations to happen, the disintegration of Rome, prepared the way for much more than was lost. What happens in the case of civilization crumbling is something like those deep ocean currents that bring nutrients to the top, and out of this spawn an incredible variety of new life. I think this is too seldom talked about in history, that the fall of the Roman Empire and the rebuilding which followed spawned treasures far beyond the capacity of Rome, Greece, or the Byzantine Empire. Consider these: the art of the Renaissance, the humanitarian philosophies, the medical revolution, that phenomenon named Shakespeare, the great poets, Beethoven's symphonies, in fact, a whole explosion of music that has persisted until our day. Plus, our present technology then, and slightly over 50 years, has gone from the first spruce and fabric airplane to putting a man on the moon. Should this civilization fall? It happens. There are a lot of factors right now that make some shake-up sound quite desirable. For example, as I've been saying for years, and as you've read in the newspaper recently, the nuclear bomb is no longer the exclusive property of reasonable and mature nations like the United States, Russia, China, so on. We are about at the time of nuclear capacity, potentially in the hands of any country willing to pay the price, and even extremely large industrial corporations or even extremely wealthy individuals. And as I said in a news conference yesterday, the idea of IT&T having an atomic bomb just scares the hell out of me. In addition to all of that, we're beginning to fool out with DNA, with cloning. We're on the edge of something that is potentially much more frightening than bombs. I was in medical seminars in New York last year in which we saw experiments in which the pain and pleasure centers of the brain have been isolated, and we are dangerously near the time we are going to be able to actively manipulate these in human beings. And there are a dozen other things that we have not yet gained the wisdom or the maturity to handle. Now, pessimism? Absolutely not. What I am being is an optimist. What I am saying is that there are heartening indications all around us in the power crunch, the population explosion, the food problem, and all of these things, that some of our society will become unglued before we are able to blast ourselves and our planet out of existence. In other words, I'm saying that these things we're facing may be natural checks and balances, protecting us as we slowly evolve into a more mature species. These crises may be happening as they were planned. I agree with Arthur C. Clarke and a number of other writers who have stated that call it what you will, God, El, Allah, von Däniken space travelers, if you want to go that way. Any wisdom capable of putting intelligence on this planet is no doubt capable of a plan that will protect it through its present childhood until we have reached a point we are able to take care of ourselves. We are going to have another chance and another and still another, if we need it, until we have built an adult reasoning civilization. And I define an adult reasoning civilization quite simply as one in which our capacity to love has become as great as our ability to destroy. Well, I've been speaking of racial childhood, and that of course helps bring me back to television. And it's hard to talk about television and remain serious. There are a few places where so many truly funny things can happen. One of the funniest incidents in some time happened while we were making a movie of the week science fiction pilot called The Quester Tapes. And for those of you who did not catch the show on television, it was the story of an android robot who was outwardly indistinguishable from a human male, other than perhaps that the programming of his computer mind made him incapable of hate, jealousy, greed, violence, and other television star qualities. In the original draft of the show, Quester was searching for the man who had built him, the man who had created him, which some of the executives there thought immediately irresponsible on my part, because whoever heard of a character in drama who was interested in the reason for his existence? At any rate, the only way Quester could locate his creator was through a very, very lovely lady who refused to talk. Fortunately, the android had been programmed in literature, which included the work of de Maupassant, through which he had learned that sometimes the human female will open her mind to a man to whom she has opened other channels of communication. In my original script, the android then made love to her. He was programmed for excellence in many areas, and he secured the necessary information. I was called to a meeting of the executives. A robot doing it to a woman was clearly unacceptable. Yeah, you think that's funny? Can you imagine the problem I would have had if I'd written a gay robot? I carefully explained to these executives she didn't know he was a robot, that I would use the usual good taste. These things wouldn't be seen on the screen, but they still refused, and a great argument ensued. At first I thought my opponents were showing human jealousy, perhaps a masculine resentment against a mechanical man who could presumably do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, for as long as he wanted. But it turned out, no, that wasn't it at all. Our agreement turned out to be much more basic. I realized by the time we were done, what they were really trying to say to me is, after all, Gene, would you want your sister to sleep with a robot? As some of you know, I lost the argument. Quester did not get the girl. But I went home rather happy that night, because how often is it in a writer's career that he has an opportunity to build a whole new area of intolerance? Another incident concerned another science fiction television movie pilot called Genesis 2. And as a pilot for a potential science fiction series, I think it probably offered a range of stories and comment similar to Star Trek. And it's not generally known. We had this series tentatively sold to CBS. The network then ran a full-length movie called Planet of the Apes. And it was tough competition. It was a theatrical movie, top budget, directed by the very talented Franklin Schaffner. Until that time, our show, Genesis 2, had been the highest-rated Thursday night movie of the week. Planet of the Apes went 12 Nielsen points higher. Those of you who have studied American television can probably guess immediately what happened. The network programming office cried, "Apes, the public wants apes." There was considerable panic at Warner Brothers, where we had made my pilot. They said, "You've got to save Genesis 2. Isn't there some way you can add apes to Genesis 2? Or baboons or something?" Let me take you inside a motion picture studio. It was at that time that we had a junior executive make one of those bright front office suggestions that make Hollywood so interesting. He suggested that we consider the possibility that perhaps we could have a new kind of animal in our show, that perhaps man's best friend had evolved into a hind-legged species of talking dog. And intending to be sarcastic, I said, "No, wait, I've got something that's much better. I'm thinking of a turtle man creature, which will give our show, you see, an underwater dimension." And I think I first realized it was all over when I could see they were taking that suggestion seriously. There is a Star Trek story that's never been printed. It concerns the true story of how Leonard Nimoy became the unemotional, logical Mr. Spock. And it started with the first Star Trek pilot that you'll be seeing after I'm finished here. This was the first pilot that was turned down by NBC because it was considered too cerebral for you slobs out in the television audience. It did go on to win the International Hugo Award, which is, I suppose, what happens to... those of you who are students of drama, telecommunications, and so on, will find this pilot interesting, although it is in black and white. They thought so little of it, they didn't bother to save a color copy after it was turned down. And although some of it was put into a two-part Star Trek episode called The Menagerie, this has never been shown on television, this full version which stars Jeffrey Hunter as the captain. And you'll see, those of you who are interested in how a television show develops will see many of the changes that we later made to the vessel, to the characterizations. It may also interest those of you who believe in sexual equality that in this original effort, the second in command of the USS Enterprise was a female. And after NBC ordered a second pilot, they came to me and said, "You're going to have to make some changes. The woman has to go because we can't believe a woman in command of anything." And to show their intelligence, that was the same time they said, "You'll have to also get rid of the guy with the ears." It seemed to me that perhaps I could fight and save one of the two. And the woman was the one in the pilot who had the analytical mind, the unemotional qualities. So I gave those qualities to the Mr. Spock character and kept him on the show, and I married the woman, I guess because in California it would have been illegal for me to do it the other way around. On the question of sexual equality, also in the first format, we had the crew of the ship made up 50% men, 50% women. We received another one of those visits, and they said, you can't have that, and we said, why on earth not? And they said, well, because it will look like there's an awful lot of fooling around going out in space. And we tried to argue with them, and they started from the position they got to be all men. And we argued, and finally they came back to us, and I don't know where they get figures like this, but they said, okay, we've made a decision, you make or break, you can have 30% women. And I thought, well, hell, 30% healthy young girls could take care of the rest of the crew anyway, so I let it go at that. I mentioned earlier the mind-expanding quality of working in science fiction, and you can hardly deal in propositions that in the equality of life forms across an entire galaxy and not believe that sexual equality is so basic that we should have resolved that argument long ago when we learned to be ashamed of slavery and other idiocies. I'd like to talk for a while now about television in a way that you may never have heard. Not bitterly. Television has treated me very well. Let me simply describe television as you would hear it described if we were sitting here in my office or inside my home talking to other creative elements inside the industry. First of all, there is little point in discussing, unfortunately, public television. Not at this time, perhaps never. If it becomes something like BBC, which is in effect paid television, there's a tax on every television set, perhaps that can become a major force. But until it gets proper budgets, public television cannot be a major force. What the name of the game is the 94% of all television broadcast in this country, commercial television. Now let's understand something, because it'll answer a lot of questions about why do some shows go off the air, why do some make it, and why don't others. Commercial television, ladies and gentlemen, does not exist to entertain you. It does not exist to inform you. Its corporate purpose has nothing at all to do with your welfare. It is an advertising medium. Its corporate purpose is to sell you products. This is not opinion, this is fact. Except in rare circumstances involving brave men willing to risk their careers and often not being disappointed in that. And to be fair, this has included some bold television executives and some bold independent television operators. Except for these cases, the total choice of what you see and hear on television is made solely on the basis of does it or does it not sell toothpaste, deodorant, beer, automobiles, and so on. One of the greatest frauds perpetrated on the public is in the warning you have heard, don't pay now for what you're getting free. You already have pay television. You pay very heavily for it in everything you buy. You pay for it whether you see it or not. You pay for it whether you own a television set or not. I'm not recommending doing away with commercial television. I'm not against advertising. But I do think it is highly dangerous that this whole nation's only choice is will it or will it not sell toothpaste. As presently constituted, therefore, it is primarily interested in mass audience. Here's something you may not know. In order to get a prime-time television show on the air and to keep it there, you must attract and hold every week an audience of something like 18 to 20 million people. Putting that in its proper perspective, except when seen on television, that is more people than have seen Shakespeare in all the world and all the time since it was first written. Shows like the prestigious National Geographic show go off the air. They do not sell enough toothpaste. Of no importance whatsoever under our system of commercial television is the fact that this program enriched a whole nation with its rare and intelligent look at our planet, its geography, and its life forms. Although I do joke about television executives, I insist on my right to criticize them and the networks where they deserve it. But again, I also admit there are executives and independents who do try to do good programming. But you must understand, they are as much prisoners of this system as we who write and produce in it. You often hear television complimenting itself that it's getting better, that it now has bold and controversial programs, and a surface examination makes this appear to be so. I challenge you to dig a little bit deeper. Compare the so-called bold and daring programs that you've seen on television with the spectrum of books available in your bookstore. Books pro and con every subject in this world. You say television can't do that? I think it's time we started asking, why not? This medium, although still in its infancy, is broadcasting with terrifying sound and image power billions of people hours every week around our globe. I'd like to talk about where it's going. This is something that affects you more. Those stakes, those issues that I've been talking about, are going to be rapidly dwarfed by something that's going to happen to every one of you sitting here. And I'm going to get into something that may sound a bit like science fiction. I'm going to make a prediction now that I mean far more seriously and believe far more strongly than any we ever made on Star Trek. We stand today at the beginning of a new explosion in human communications, telecommunications, whose effects may be as great as that which followed the invention of the Gutenberg press. When it happens, and if we can bend it toward the pressing needs of humanity, may change a great deal of the picture of how much of our society we lose and how much of the good that we're able to keep. Here's what we're moving toward. For one thing, your television, basic television set, which has been unchanged for 25 years, is not going to stay unchanged another 5 years. There is now pre-production models off the assembly line in Japan of a whole new television tube as thin as a pane of window glass, which you can hang on the wall like a picture. The picture is metered in from the side, computed. In other words, without projection, we are at the beginning of wall television. This is only the beginning. Hundreds of millions of dollars right now are being invested in cable television on the virtual certainty that we will have, within 12 years, a totally cabled nation. That in itself is only the beginning, because from the things I've seen on the drawing boards and the experiments, satellite transmission directly to you will probably become a reality before all of that cable is laid. Here's a couple of other things that are going to happen. Your television set almost certainly now is going to be eventually mated with some sort of a duplicator, a Xerox type thing. We will still have our newspapers, thank God, but they will be delivered to us rolling out of the set under this much more efficient method. Within minutes after a newspaper is set to bed in its computer, it can be transmitted and picked up in homes. It will almost certainly become our postal service, and as I commented yesterday, thank God, because we do need a postal service. It will almost certainly be mated with some form of simple home computer, which we will do our billings, our bank statements, our shopping, our credit exchange. It no doubt will become the telephone or video phone of the future. The question has been asked very often, will it lead people away from books? I think most failures in predictions are failures in courage. I don't see right now how such a thing could print and bind books, but perhaps it's because we're thinking of books in the wrong way. There may be another way to receive books where you can order from the library a book of any type, anytime you want, and have it delivered on this thing. Perhaps in as small a thing as a cube that you insert in a thing, and it'll give you the different pages, allow you to stop, flip through, center on whatever you want. What is happening, though, goes far beyond that. All we lack at the moment for the final type of television is a non-linear way of storing sound and image, and we're going to have that very soon. When we have that, here's what's going to happen. We know our technology is capable of almost infinite television channels. Therefore, we are moving toward a time in which you will decide what you want to see and order it at any time you want to see it, rather than waiting for someone to broadcast something to you at a time convenient to them. Everything capable of being stored in sound and image will ultimately be available to you. I think we'll store it in the form of a small booklet. I think we'll grow very rapidly into the size of the Manhattan telephone directory, in which if you want to see some ballet, or you have a group there and you say, let's see Gone with the Wind again, the last recorded sporting event or news broadcast, a course in Spanish, Ibsen's plays, if you want it, Beverly Hillbillies rerun for those who want that. And I think there's room for everything. What you will do is you will dial a code or punch a code into this, and at the time that you want to see it, whether it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon or 2 a.m. in the morning, you will have that beamed to you at exactly what you want when it's convenient for you. What I'm moving toward in concluding is we are probably less than 20 years away from having something extraordinary in our grasp. If we have the wisdom to demand it, and we have the courage to demand it, because it will take some courage, we will have a way of every human being on earth having total access to the recorded knowledge of all humanity. If we can make that begin to happen, at that moment, the barriers that have held so many of us apart over all these centuries, and the barriers that have held so many of us down, at that moment will almost certainly begin to crumble. In A Sleep of Prisoners, Christopher Fry wrote these following lines, and I think it bears on what we're talking about. He wrote, "This is no winter now. The frozen misery of centuries breaks, cracks, begins to move. The thunder is the thunder of the flows, the thaw, the upstart spring. Thank God our time is now, when wrong comes up to face us everywhere, never to leave us until we take the longest strides of soul men ever took." We tried to say something of that to you in Star Trek. That is something of what today is all about. That in one area is why it is not all over, of why the challenge may just be beginning for us. And the human challenge is just beginning, I believe. The human experiment is far from over. If we are wise, I think we probably have now reached just the beginning of new beginnings. Thank you for letting me share some thoughts with you, and I'll throw it open now to questions. I refuse to answer questions on warp speed from engineering students. Otherwise, I'll try to answer almost anything. Yes, right here. Can you stand and shout out so we can hear? What do I feel will be the next major energy source? I think probably there's a good chance it'll be a fusion, but I think we have many sources until then. I think that we're not in nearly as much trouble as we think we are, although it may take some breakdown of our society for us to all begin to pull together and get ourselves out of trouble, regardless of what our energy source is. As long as we stay divided and fighting in the petty way that we're doing it now, none of it's going to work. We'll just be using energy to kill more people more rapidly. Another question. What kind of ideas do I have for the colonization of the moon? I really have not dug very deeply into that. I have no doubt that we'll go there and that we'll do it. But as a dramatist, it just has not been that exciting a subject because of the confinement in the early days and the lack of interaction between characters. My feeling about space is this. I think we belong in space. We belong there just as much as we belong here. One of my favorite moments although I have some criticism of aspects of Space Odyssey 201, it had some remarkable moments, and I think one of the loveliest was as those giant ships were docking, they played the Blue Danube, stating to us that we belong here just as much as we belong in river valleys of Earth. We belong wherever we can go. I think the argument that is too often waged that shall we have space travel or shall we have ecology I think, is a false argument. Any nation that can afford to spend over $1 billion a year on cosmetics can afford to have both. Yes, sir.
Do you have any more current plans for more movies like Genesis 2, Earth 2, and will they have a chance of becoming a series?
I think we have a good chance of Quester Tapes becoming a series. NBC's made some sounds that way. Genesis 2, I think, is going to have to wait for a while because when they replace it with Planet of the Apes, you can't expect a network programming executive to then put the show on that he turned down, because if it should be a success after he turned it down, it may make his job a little shaky. So I think we're going to have to wait till we have the normal turnover of management. I think, however, if the Star Trek motion picture is a success, we will probably have a succession of other pictures, and which will lead to a return to television, not in the hourly show, which is very tough to do, but something we'd much rather do is do a series of 90-minute or 2-hour Star Trek specials every season with adequate budgets and so on. They'd be fun. Yes, sir. Oh yeah, we've had a few things like that. We did the patient monitor on the hospital bed at about the same time Mayo Clinic was beginning their experiments in that. The Navy uses our basic bridge setup for a communication center. They found it so properly met their needs. NASA has admitted since Star Trek that they probably are going to have to go the Star Trek way on very long space voyages of putting communities up there. They are beginning to accept now what we said in our original format, that not only does man need food and oxygen and things like that to stay alive and to stay well, he needs community. He needs the interactions of people. So although you could conceivably design any sort of ship that 1 or 2 people can handle, when they get there, they'll probably be mad. You're much better off to send along 100 and have a whole interaction of all of the things in life, including sex, which is they're discovering lately that that's quite important to people. Scientists come up with some really great things. Yes, sir.
There seems to be a change of Star Trek. Let's say was in the third year, the second year. I was wondering if there was any difference in your position.
Yes, there was a change in the third year. When they put us on Friday night at 10 o'clock, why, I recognized, of course, that they had decided to kill the show. I suspect they were a little offended that the television audience sent all those letters, and, you know, what did the audience think they own the airwaves? And so when they put us at 10 o'clock Friday night, it was obvious the show was going to die, so I moved back out of active supervision and moved on to some other projects. So we had a change of producers. I would not care to comment whether he did the job better or worse, but the point is, when you let someone else come in and produce, you must let him produce it his way. So the program did change. A couple more questions and we'll get on to the movie. Yes, back here. What does a producer do? Yeah, well, you know, it's a legitimate question. I was the producer the first half of the first year in Star Trek, and then the executive producer. Whether you're talking about producer or executive producer, what it really means is you're the boss. You check or approve every bit of casting, costume, set. The writers come to you with their stories. You tell them how to change them. And the reason you have so many producer-writers in television is if he doesn't change it the way you need it, then ultimately you have to sit down and do the polish, and you lose friends like this. I lost some fine science fiction writer friends in the first year of Star Trek because I rewrote them. Not necessarily that I made the shows better, but obviously I had to have Spock the same next week as he was 2 weeks ago. After a show's been on an air a year or so, everyone knows how it's going to be, but when it begins, it's strictly in your mind. So the producer is the boss. In Hollywood now, in motion pictures, there is a subtle change. The director tends to be more the creative whole, because a motion picture is a one-time thing. In television, directors come and go. And so you have to have one person there who keeps it the same all the time, and that is from the producers. One more question, and yes, sir, right here. Yes, sir. Well, I think if you're asking, is the medium television medium potentially dangerous to us? I think potentially anything of that power can be highly dangerous. I think it is dangerous right now. Television appeals to the television is beamed now to uncommitted people with malleable minds. Any device that can take a slogan like "Ring around the collar" and send people charging down to their market to buy a new type of soap has got to be able to affect people in even much more powerful ways. And that does work. Otherwise, you wouldn't be putting these millions of dollars in advertising. So it is potentially a dangerous medium. The way to relieve it of being dangerous is the way that the forefathers of this country, in considerable wisdom, enacted the First Amendment. Well, television must ultimately go the direction that books have always gone, that everyone who can get something made and produced has the right to put on the air what he can put there. We must take some chances. We must take some chances that we do in books, that someone is going to write something pro-fascist, because unless we give him that right, we have no possibility of writing the way we want to write. The one question that scares me, comes up far too often at colleges, is, yeah, but how will we control what people see? The whole point of it is we must not control it. We must take our chances. Jefferson was right. If you give the people all the facts, give them the broadest spectrum of things, there is an innate wisdom out there that will permit them to make, and I think they will make, the wise choice. If he was not right about this, we'd probably been screwing around with democracy for 200 years too long. I say he was right, and I think we've got to extend freedom to television too, because it's too powerful. Let me finish with just one story to back up your point. I was sitting in a meeting of men who sell television around the world. One of these men, extraordinarily bright man with advanced degrees in many fields, but he also happened to be a great salesman and had gone into selling shows all over the world. He made this statement about Africa at this time, and this was at a time when many of the nations were emerging. We were talking about control of these places. He said, "Don't give me control of the political systems." He said, "I don't want the armies." He said, "You give me television in Africa for 10 years, and in 10 years I will own the continent." I think you can apply that almost anywhere in the world. So it is dangerous, and that's why we must fight for freedom there, just like we fight for everywhere else. Thank you again. You've been a great audience. I hope you enjoy the film that you're going to see.